Yes, I do.
I do.
Amazing. It does.
Sarah found the text message at exactly 11:47 at night, glowing on a phone that wasn't even hers. 3 words. That's all it took to end 14 years of marriage and 31 years of sisterhood in the same breath. He's asleep now, sent from her younger sister's number, straight to her husband's phone. Like it was nothing, like it was routine. And in that single moment, standing barefoot in her own kitchen at midnight, Sarah realized the 2 people she trusted more than anyone else on earth had been living a second life right in front of her. And she had missed every single sign of it. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where her sister Rachel had eaten dinner every Sunday for the last 3 years. And she read the message again and again until the words stopped making sense and started feeling like something out of someone else's life. Because this couldn't be her life. Her husband, Michael, was the man who had walked her down memory lane on their honeymoon and cried at their daughter's christening. Rachel was the woman who had slept in her bed during thunderstorms when they were kids, who had stood beside her at the altar in a pale blue dress, holding her bouquet while she said, "I do." What Sarah didn't know yet, sitting there in the dark with her phone screen the only light in the room, was that this text message wasn't the beginning of anything. It was the tail end of something that had already been going on for far longer than she could have imagined. Hidden inside the small excuses and quiet absences she had explained away for years without ever asking the one question that mattered. And what she was about to discover over the next few days wouldn't just break her heart. It would completely rewrite everything she thought she understood about loyalty, about family, and about the 2 people she loved the most in this entire world. Before we go any further into how this story unfolds, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next in that quiet house didn't just involve a husband and a wife. It involved a mother, 3 children, 2 sets of parents who would eventually be forced to choose a side, and one final discovery buried so deep in old bank statements and forwarded emails that even Sarah's own lawyer would go quiet for a moment when she finally laid it all out on the table. This wasn't simply a story about a man who cheated. This was a story about exactly how far 2 people were willing to go to protect a secret, and exactly how much it would cost everyone around them once that secret finally came apart. To understand how Sarah ended up standing in her kitchen at midnight holding a phone that wasn't hers, you have to go back 3 years, to the winter Rachel's own marriage fell apart and she showed up on Sarah and Michael's doorstep with 2 suitcases and nowhere else to go. Nobody thought twice about it. That's what family does. Sarah gave her sister the guest room without hesitation, and for the first few months, it felt like they were kids again, staying up late in the kitchen, laughing over cheap wine, rebuilding a bond that adulthood had slowly worn thin. Michael was kind to her too, the way any good brother-in-law would be, helping her fix her car, co-signing a lease when she finally found her own apartment. It all looked, from the outside, like exactly what it was supposed to be. But somewhere in those quiet months of shared dinners and late-night conversations, something between Rachel and Michael shifted in a way nobody around that table noticed, least of all Sarah, who was working double shifts at the hospital and coming home too exhausted most nights to see what was happening in front of her. Looking back now, she can point to a dozen small moments that meant nothing at the time. A joke that landed a little too easily. A hand resting a second too long on a shoulder. A closeness that felt, at the time, like nothing more than 2 people who loved her finding comfort in each other during a hard season. She had no reason to suspect otherwise. She trusted them both completely, and that trust is exactly what let this go on for as long as it did, right underneath her own roof. To really understand what was lost that night in the kitchen, you have to understand what Sarah and Michael had built together over 14 years, because it wasn't built on nothing. They met in their mid-20s at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue, back when Sarah was working nights to get through nursing school and Michael was just starting out at a small logistics company he would eventually help run. Their friends still tell the story of how he spent the entire evening trying to make her laugh, and how she pretended not to notice him for almost 2 hours before finally giving in. Within a year they were engaged. Within 2, they were married in a small church with Rachel standing beside her the entire time, holding her flowers, fixing her veil, crying harder than the bride herself. Their marriage, by every outward measure, was a good one. They bought a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind with a porch light that clicked on automatically at dusk. They had 2 children together, a boy and a girl, and Michael coached the boys' little league team every spring without missing a single game. Friends described them as the couple other couples measured themselves against, not because they were flashy or perfect, but because they seemed genuinely, quietly happy in a way that felt rare. Sarah worked hard, sometimes too hard, but she always said it was for the family, and nobody around her ever doubted that for a second. Rachel's life, by contrast, had never quite settled the same way. She was 3 years younger than Sarah, and the 2 of them had grown up close in a house where their parents worked long hours and the sisters mostly raised each other. Rachel married young, at 23, to a man named David who turned out to be controlling in ways nobody outside their marriage fully understood until it was already ending. By the time she was 30, she was divorced, working part-time at a marketing firm, and quietly struggling in ways she rarely admitted out loud, even to Sarah. She was proud. She hated asking for help. But when her lease fell through the same month her divorce was finalized, she didn't have anywhere else to turn. That's how she ended up in Sarah and Michael's guest room that winter. And at first, it genuinely was exactly what it looked like. 3 adults figuring out a hard season together, no different from 100 other families who open their doors to a sibling in crisis. Sarah has said, looking back now, that those first few months might have been some of the closest she and Rachel had ever been as adults. They cooked together most nights. They watched old movies after the kids went to bed. For a while, it felt like healing, for both of them, after years of drifting apart the way adult siblings sometimes do once they have households and children and separate lives pulling them in different directions. What Sarah didn't see, because she had no reason to look for it, was how naturally Michael and Rachel began filling the space she left behind on the nights she worked late. Started small. Rachel would already have dinner started by the time Sarah got home, and Michael would already be laughing at something Rachel had said before Sarah even walked through the door. Neither of them thought much of it at first, if you believe what they've said since. It was easy. It was comfortable. And comfortable, in a house already full of trust, is exactly the kind of thing nobody questions until it's far too late to undo what's already been done. By the spring of that first year, something between them had shifted from comfortable into something neither of them was willing to name out loud, not even to themselves. There was no single moment either of them can point to now as the moment it changed, no dramatic confession, no clear line they crossed together. It happened the way these things almost always happen, in small increments so gradual that by the time it became undeniable, it no longer felt like a betrayal to either of them. Felt, somehow, like something that had simply always been there, waiting. Sarah, meanwhile, was living an entirely different version of that same year. She was exhausted most nights, grateful that her sister was there to help with the kids, grateful that Michael seemed happier, more relaxed, more present with the family than he had been in a long time. She credits herself now for missing the signs, but anyone looking honestly at her life that year would understand exactly why she didn't see it. She was working double shifts. She was raising 2 young children. She was, in every sense, doing exactly what a devoted wife and mother is supposed to do, and the 2 people closest to her were using that devotion as cover for something she couldn't have imagined even if she'd tried. It would be almost 2 full years before the first crack in that cover finally showed. And even then, Sarah almost talked herself out of what she saw with her own eyes. The first crack came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in early spring, almost 2 years after Rachel had moved into that guest room, though of course nobody knew at the time that it would end up matching at all. Sarah had left work early with a migraine, something that almost never happened, and she came home to an empty driveway and a house that felt strangely still. She assumed Michael was still at the office and Rachel was out running errands, so she let herself in quietly, took 2 aspirin, and lay down on the living room couch to wait for the pounding in her head to ease before she had to pick the kids up from school. It was Michael's laugh that woke her almost 40 minutes later, low and easy, coming from somewhere upstairs, followed by Rachel's voice, softer than Sarah had ever heard her sister speak to anyone. For a moment, still half asleep, Sarah simply assumed they were both home earlier than expected and thought nothing of it. It was only when she sat up and realized neither of their cars was in the driveway, that both of them had walked home together from somewhere, that a small, cold feeling settled into her chest for the very first time. She didn't call out. She didn't go upstairs. She sat perfectly still on that couch and listened to the silence that followed, and for reasons she still can't fully explain, she chose not to ask a single question that day. Looking back, Sarah has said this was the moment she now wishes she had trusted herself. But it's easy to say that now, with everything she knows today. At the time, the explanation Michael gave when she finally asked, almost too casually, why his car wasn't in the driveway was simple enough to believe. He said Rachel had picked him up from the shop where his truck was getting serviced, and they'd walked the last few blocks together because it was a nice day. It was a small, forgettable detail. It made perfect sense. And Sarah, exhausted and still fighting off her migraine, chose to believe it, because the alternative wasn't something her mind was prepared to consider yet. Over the following months, small moments like that one began to accumulate, each one easy enough to explain away on its own. But forming a pattern Sarah wouldn't let herself see clearly until much later. Rachel started staying out later on weekends, always with some new excuse, a work event, a friend from her marketing job, a date that never seemed to go anywhere. Michael started taking his phone into the bathroom with him, something he had never done before, and got quietly irritated whenever Sarah asked to borrow it to check the weather or look something up. None of it, on its own, felt like proof of anything. Together, it painted a picture Sarah simply wasn't ready to look at directly. The night everything finally broke open started the same way most Tuesdays did, with Sarah working a late shift at the hospital and coming home just before midnight, expecting the house to be dark and quiet the way it always was. Instead, she found Rachel's phone sitting on the kitchen counter, charging, left behind by mistake when Rachel had rushed out earlier that evening to meet a friend. A notification lit up the screen just as Sarah walked past it. A preview of a text message from a contact saved simply as M. 3 words. He's asleep now. Sarah stood frozen in her own kitchen, staring at a message that made no sense and complete sense all at the same time. She didn't wake Michael. She didn't call Rachel. Instead, she sat down at that same kitchen table where they had all shared so many dinners together, and she scrolled backward through months of messages between her husband and her sister, messages that had been quietly deleted from Michael's own phone but never from Rachel's, because Rachel, for reasons Sarah still doesn't fully understand, had kept almost everything. What she found in those messages wasn't just proof of an affair that had clearly been going on for over a year. It was something far worse, a conversation from several weeks earlier that mentioned money, a joint account Sarah didn't know existed, and a plan neither of them had ever intended for her to find out about at all. Sarah didn't confront either of them that night. She sat at that kitchen table until nearly 4 in the morning, reading and rereading messages that stretched back almost 14 months, watching a private conversation unfold between two people she had trusted completely, and slowly piecing together a timeline that made her physically sick. By the time the sun came up, she had already screenshotted everything, forwarded it to her own email, and quietly packed a small bag for herself and the kids. She wasn't ready to have the conversation yet. She needed proof first, and more than that, she needed to understand exactly what that mention of money and a joint account actually meant before she said a single word to either of them. It took her 3 days to find the answer, and when she did, it turned out to be worse than she expected. The account Rachel had referenced in one of those messages wasn't just a shared savings account between the two of them. It was connected to a small inheritance Sarah's grandmother had left specifically for her grandchildren's education fund years earlier, money that had been sitting untouched since before the kids were even born. Michael, it turned out, had quietly moved himself into a co-signer position on that account almost a year earlier, using paperwork Sarah had signed without reading closely during a particularly busy week, back when she trusted him completely enough not to question anything he put in front of her. When Sarah finally confronted them both, she did it in person on a Saturday afternoon, with both of her parents present as witnesses, because she wanted no room left for either of them to deny what she had already seen in writing. Michael's first reaction was denial, insisting the messages meant something entirely different than what they clearly said. Rachel, by contrast, broke down almost immediately, and in the middle of her crying, she said something that changed the entire shape of the story Sarah thought she was telling. She said this hadn't started as an affair at all. It had started, according to Rachel, as an attempt to protect Sarah from something Michael had already been doing long before Rachel ever moved into that guest room. That single sentence sent Sarah down a different path entirely, away from simply grieving a broken marriage and into something closer to an actual investigation. She spent the following weeks going through old bank statements, forgotten emails, and receipts from business trips Michael had taken years earlier. Trips Sarah had never once questioned because she had no reason to. What she began to uncover suggested that Michael had been quietly siphoning small amounts from various family accounts for years, long before Rachel ever became involved, using the affair itself, according to Rachel's account, as leverage to keep Rachel quiet about what she claimed she had accidentally discovered not long after moving in. Rachel's version of events painted her as someone caught between protecting her sister and protecting herself, claiming Michael had threatened to make her financial struggles from her divorce far worse if she ever said anything to Sarah about what she'd found. Whether that justification was true, or simply the easiest story for Rachel to tell herself and everyone else after the fact, became the central question dividing the rest of the family for months afterward. Sarah's parents, upon hearing Rachel's side, found themselves torn in ways neither of them expected, unable to fully abandon a daughter who had made an unforgivable choice, but equally unable to dismiss the possibility that Michael had put her in an impossible position to begin with. Meanwhile, Michael continued denying any financial wrongdoing entirely, insisting Rachel's claims were an exaggeration meant to shift blame away from an affair she had chosen just as willingly as he had. He hired a lawyer within the first week. He moved out of the house without an argument, but he fought Sarah on almost everything else, from the children's custody arrangement to the very account at the center of Rachel's accusations, which he insisted he had every legal right to access. For months, the case moved through lawyers and mediators and forensic accountants combing through years of financial records, each side presenting a different version of exactly how and when this had all truly begun, and Sarah found herself no longer certain which betrayal had actually come first, or which one had caused the other. It was during one of those forensic reviews, nearly 5 months after that first sleepless night at the kitchen table, that Sarah's lawyer uncovered something in Michael's records that neither Michael nor Rachel had accounted for. Something that would completely change how Sarah understood everything that had happened inside that house over the previous 3 years. What Sarah's lawyer found wasn't connected to the education fund at all. It was an entirely separate account, opened almost 4 years earlier, well before Rachel had ever moved into that guest room, well before anyone had any reason to suspect Michael of anything. The account had been opened under a slight variation of Michael's own name, just different enough to avoid immediate detection, and it had been quietly funded over the years by small, irregular transfers pulled from Michael's business trips, his year-end bonuses, and even a portion of the mortgage refinance Sarah had signed off on years earlier, believing it was meant to lower their monthly payments. Instead, thousands of dollars had been redirected, a little at a time, into an account Sarah never knew existed. This discovery reframed everything that had come before it. Rachel's claim that she had stumbled onto evidence of Michael's financial dishonesty shortly after moving in suddenly looked far more credible, and far more complicated, than anyone had initially assumed. According to Rachel, once she found out what Michael had been doing, he convinced her that exposing him would only hurt Sarah further, especially given how fragile Rachel's own finances were at the time. He offered to help her get back on her feet financially in exchange for her silence, an arrangement that, according to Rachel, slowly blurred into something far more personal over the following months, until neither of them could say clearly anymore where the financial secret ended and the emotional one began. Sarah's lawyer built much of the case around this timeline once the second account came to light, arguing that Michael had used financial pressure to manipulate Rachel first, well before any physical relationship developed between them, and that this context mattered a great deal both for how the divorce settlement should be handled and for how the family should ultimately view what had happened. Michael's own lawyer pushed back hard against this framing, insisting his client had made mistakes but had not manipulated anyone, and that Rachel was an adult fully capable of making her own choices regardless of any financial difficulty she may have been experiencing at the time. The case eventually reached a courtroom for a contested hearing over asset division, and it was there, under oath, that Michael finally admitted to opening the second account, though he continued to insist the affair itself had developed independently of any financial arrangement between himself and Rachel. Sarah sat through that entire hearing without saying a word, watching the man she had built a life with for 14 years try to minimize, piece by piece, exactly how much he had taken from her, both financially and emotionally, over the course of several years while she had no idea any of it was happening around her. Rachel did not attend that hearing. She had, by that point, stopped speaking to Michael entirely, according to their parents, and had moved out of state to stay with a cousin, unwilling to face Sarah directly after everything that had come out. In a brief written statement submitted through Sarah's lawyer as part of the proceedings, Rachel apologized for her role in the affair but maintained that she had genuinely believed, at least at first, that she was protecting her sister rather than betraying her, a claim that Sarah has said she still doesn't fully know what to do with, even now. The judge ultimately ruled in Sarah's favor regarding both the education fund and the undisclosed account, ordering Michael to repay the diverted funds in full alongside a significant portion of the marital assets. But for Sarah, the financial outcome, as important as it was for her children's future, never felt like the real resolution to this story. The real reckoning happened months later, privately, in a conversation with her parents that revealed one final detail nobody involved in the case had ever uncovered. A detail that had nothing to do with money at all, and everything to do with exactly how long her family had actually known something was wrong before she ever found that text message on Rachel's phone. The conversation with her parents happened almost by accident, over coffee on a Sunday afternoon nearly 8 months after that first sleepless night at the kitchen table. Sarah's mother, without fully realizing the weight of what she was saying, mentioned in passing that Rachel had called her, upset, almost 2 years earlier, hinting that something was wrong at Sarah's house, though she never said exactly what. At the time, Sarah's mother assumed it was ordinary sisterly tension, the kind that flares up and fades away on its own, and she told Rachel gently to work it out herself rather than involve anyone else. She never mentioned it to Sarah, not because she was hiding anything, but because she genuinely believed it wasn't significant enough to matter. Sarah sat completely still when she heard this, doing the math in her head almost automatically. 2 years earlier placed that phone call only a few months after Rachel had first moved into the guest room, well before the affair had fully taken hold, back when Rachel, by her own later admission, had first discovered what Michael was doing with the family's money. It meant Rachel had tried, in her own limited way, to reach out for help before any of this became what it eventually became, and that the moment had simply slipped past unnoticed, treated as nothing more than sisters not getting along, rather than what it may have actually been, a warning nobody recognized in time. This detail didn't excuse anything Rachel had done afterward. Sarah has been clear about that, both privately and in the little she has shared publicly since. But it added a layer of grief to the story that she hadn't expected to carry, a quiet, aching sense that somewhere in an ordinary phone call between a mother and a daughter, there had been an opening, a moment where all of this might have unfolded differently, if only someone had asked one more question, if only someone had pushed a little harder to understand what Rachel was actually trying to say. In the 2 years since the divorce was finalized, Sarah has rebuilt a life for herself and her children that looks almost nothing like the one she had before. She sold the house with the automatic porch light and moved into a smaller place across town, closer to the children's school. She and Michael maintain a strained but functional co-parenting arrangement, mostly conducted through a scheduling app rather than any real conversation. She has not spoken to Rachel since the day of that confrontation at her parents' house, though she says she thinks about her more than she expected to, not with hatred exactly, but with a complicated grief for a relationship that no longer exists in any form she recognizes. What lingers most for Sarah, more than the affair itself, more even than the money Michael quietly siphoned away over the years, is the realization of how easily an entire family can miss what's happening directly in front of them when everyone involved has a reason, however small, to look away. A tired wife working double shifts. A mother dismissing a daughter's vague unhappiness as ordinary sibling friction. A husband who understood exactly how much trust could shield a person from suspicion, and used every bit of it. None of them set out to build the kind of silence that let this go on for years. But that silence built itself anyway, one small missed moment at a time, until it became something none of them could undo. So here is the question worth sitting with long after this story ends. If the people closest to you were hiding something this significant, would you trust yourself to see it in time, or would love and routine and simple exhaustion make you just as likely to miss it as Sarah did? And if someone you love reached out to you the way Rachel reached out to her mother that day, vague, uncertain, almost too afraid to say the real thing out loud, would you know how to hear what they were actually asking for help with before it became something far harder to fix? If you made it this far, we want to hear your honest answer to that question. What do you think you would have done in Sarah's place? Sitting alone in that kitchen at midnight with a phone that wasn't yours lighting up in the dark. Would you have confronted them both right then? Or would you have needed time to gather proof first, the way she did? And what about Rachel's side of it? The idea that she may have started down this path trying to protect her sister rather than betray her. Does that change anything for you, or does it simply make the whole story harder to sit with? Tell us in the comments below, because these stories only mean something when we actually talk about them together. If you enjoyed the story and want to keep hearing real accounts like this one, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you're the first to know when the next video goes live. We put a lot of care into telling these stories honestly and respectfully, and the best way to support that is simply by being here, watching, and sharing your own thoughts with us. Thank you for staying with this one all the way to the end. We'll see you in the next story.